Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers can't reach and GPS signals fade to nothing, a former Navy SEAL has carved out his own kingdom. What started as a simple desire to disappear from the world has turned into something much darker. When Marcus Kane bought 2,400 acres of remote mountain wilderness, he thought he was purchasing peace. What he didn't expect was to become judge, jury, and executioner for those who dare to cross his carefully marked boundaries. The locals whisper about the strange happenings on Kane Mountain. Hunters who venture too close to the property line tell stories of feeling watched by unseen eyes. Some report hearing the crack of a rifle echoing through the valleys, but no shot was meant for game. The county sheriff has fielded dozens of missing person reports over the past 3 years, all involving people last seen heading toward the mountain's southern approach. But Marcus Kane isn't just any landowner with a gun. He's a man whose military record is so classified that even his own family doesn't know what he did in the shadows of America's longest wars. His skills with a rifle are legendary among those who served with him, and his psychological profile suggests a man who views the world through the crosshairs of absolute justice. Now, as another hunting season approaches, a new group of poachers has set their sights on the untouched wildlife sanctuary that Kane has created. They have no idea that their intended hunting ground is already claimed by a predator far more dangerous than any mountain lion or bear. They're about to discover that some mountains have guardians, and some guardians never forget how to kill. Marcus Kane stepped onto his porch as the first rays of dawn painted the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The morning air was sharp and thin at 8,000 feet, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of early snow. He held his coffee mug with both hands, feeling the warmth seep through his calloused fingers as steam rose into the crisp mountain air. At 42, Kane still moved with the fluid precision of a man trained to kill, though 3 years of mountain solitude had softened some of his military edges. The cabin he'd built with his own hands stood like a fortress against the wilderness. Constructed from local timber and stone, it blended seamlessly into the landscape while offering commanding views of the valleys below. Solar panels gleamed on the metal roof and a small wind turbine spun lazily in the morning breeze. Kane had designed every aspect of his retreat to be self-sufficient. After 15 years of depending on military supply chains and government logistics, he craved the independence that came with relying solely on himself. His property stretched across 2,400 acres of some of the most remote wilderness in Colorado. The land had cost him nearly every penny of his military savings and the proceeds from selling his house in Virginia Beach, but it was worth it for the isolation it provided. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and the closest town, Pine Ridge, was a 40-minute drive down a winding mountain road that became impassable for months during winter. Kane walked to the edge of his porch and gazed across his domain. The morning ritual never got old. He could see for miles in every direction, across valleys thick with aspen and pine, over ridgelines that had never felt the footprint of civilization. Elk grazed in the meadow below his cabin, their massive antlers catching the morning light. A pair of golden eagles circled high overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed valleys. This was exactly what he had dreamed of during those long, sleepless nights in Afghanistan and Iraq. While other soldiers talked about going home to wives and children, Kane had fantasized about finding a place where the only sounds were wind through the trees and the distant call of wildlife. A place where he could finally silence the voices that had followed him home from too many battlefields. The nightmares had been the worst part of his transition to civilian life. Not the obvious ones about explosions and firefights, though those came too. The dreams that really haunted him were the quiet ones. Memories of taking shots from impossible distances, of watching targets drop through his rifle scope, of being the invisible hand of American foreign policy. He had been very good at his job, perhaps too good. The classified missions had piled up one after another until he couldn't remember a time when killing hadn't been his primary skill. Kane finished his coffee and walked back inside the cabin. The interior was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with handcrafted wooden furniture and shelves lined with books on wilderness survival, hunting, and military history. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while the opposite wall held a gun safe that could have equipped a small army. Kane believed in being prepared for any situation, and his years of military service had taught him that trouble often arrived without warning. He pulled on his hiking boots and grabbed his day pack from a hook by the door. Today's routine would be the same as every other day for the past 3 years, a patrol of his property boundaries. The perimeter of his land was marked every 100 yards with signs warning trespassers to stay out, backed up by motion sensor cameras and a few more creative deterrents that his military experience had inspired. Kane's property abutted national forest land on 3 sides, making it a natural corridor for wildlife and unfortunately for hunters who didn't always respect private property boundaries. He had caught dozens of trespassers over the years, most of them lost hikers or hunters who had genuinely wandered onto his land by mistake. Those encounters usually ended with a polite but firm escort to the property line and a warning not to return. But some trespassers were different. Some came with intent to poach the wildlife that thrived under Kane's protection, or to use his remote land for activities that couldn't bear scrutiny. Those encounters ended differently. As Kane began his morning patrol, he followed a network of game trails that he had memorized like city streets. His footsteps were silent on the forest floor, a skill that had kept him alive through countless reconnaissance missions. Every few hundred yards he would stop and listen, using senses sharpened by years of combat to detect anything unusual in his environment. The morning patrol took him along the southern boundary of his property, where the land dropped away into a steep canyon. This was the most likely entry point for trespassers, as the canyon provided cover from the road and a natural pathway deeper into his territory. Kane had installed his most sophisticated surveillance equipment along this boundary, including thermal imaging cameras that could detect body heat from over a mile away. At the first checkpoint, Kane pulled out a tablet computer and reviewed the overnight footage from his camera network. The system was military-grade, left over from his contracting days when he had worked for a defense company that specialized in perimeter security. Most of the night's activity showed the usual parade of wildlife: deer, elk, a family of black bears, and a mountain lion that had been denning somewhere in the area. But at 3:17 a.m., Camera 7 had captured something different. Kane zoomed in on the footage and felt his jaw tighten. 4 men in camouflage gear carrying hunting rifles and heavy packs had crossed onto his property from the national forest. They had moved with purpose, not like lost hikers but like hunters who knew exactly where they were going. Kane studied the faces on the screen. The men were all middle-aged, well-equipped, and moving with the confidence of experienced outdoorsmen. But they were also trespassing on posted private property at 3 a.m, which suggested activities that wouldn't stand up to legal scrutiny. Kane had seen enough poaching operations during his patrols to recognize the signs. He switched to the live camera feeds and began tracking the intruders' progress across his land. They had made camp in a grove of aspen trees about 2 miles from his cabin, in an area where elk frequently came to graze. Kane's thermal imaging showed 4 heat signatures arranged around what appeared to be a small, well-concealed campfire. The smart play would be to call the county sheriff and report the trespassers. Kane had a good relationship with Sheriff Martinez, who understood that a former military man might want to keep unwanted visitors off his property. Martinez would send a deputy to escort the men off the land with a warning and perhaps a citation for trespassing. But Kane's property was 45 minutes from town on a good day, and the sheriff's department was understaffed and overworked. By the time a deputy arrived, the poachers would likely be gone, probably with several elk or deer illegally harvested from Kane's sanctuary. They would return another day, and Kane would be back to playing an endless game of cat and mouse with people who showed no respect for his property or the wildlife he protected. Kane made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't yet imagine. Instead of calling the sheriff, he would handle the situation himself. After all, he had 15 years of military experience in dealing with hostile forces in remote locations. 4 middle-aged poachers should present no significant challenge for a man with his skills and training. He returned to his cabin and began preparing for what he mentally classified as a reconnaissance and interdiction mission. From his gun safe, he selected a precision rifle that had been custom-built for long-range shooting. The weapon was familiar in his hands, balanced and deadly, with a scope capable of identifying targets at distances that would amaze civilian hunters. Kane also packed his ghillie suit, a camouflage garment that would make him nearly invisible in the mountain forest. He loaded his pack with supplies for a day-long operation: water, high-energy food, extra ammunition, and a first aid kit. Finally, he strapped on a combat knife that had served him well in darker days and places. As he prepared to leave the cabin, Kane caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at him was lean and weathered, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too much time squinting through rifle scopes. But there was something else in his reflection, something that had been dormant for 3 years of peaceful mountain living. The predator was waking up. Kane locked the cabin behind him and melted into the forest like a ghost. He moved through the trees with practiced stealth, following routes that avoided his own camera network and any trail that might leave tracks. The skills came back to him as naturally as breathing, reading the wind, moving silently across different terrain, using natural cover to remain invisible. As he approached the area where the poachers had made camp, Kane could smell wood smoke and hear the low murmur of voices. He positioned himself on a ridge overlooking their campsite, where his rifle would have a clear field of fire and multiple escape routes. Through his scope, he could see the four men clearly. They were professional poachers, no doubt about it. Their equipment was expensive and well-maintained. Their camp was expertly concealed, and they moved with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Kane watched them prepare their weapons and discuss their plans in voices too low for him to understand. What happened next would depend on the choices these men made. If they packed up and left his property, Kane would let them go with a warning shot to encourage their departure. But if they proceeded with their poaching operation on his land, Kane would stop them by whatever means necessary. The former Navy SEAL settled into a shooting position and waited. He had all day, and patience was a skill that had kept him alive through more dangerous situations than this. Below him, four men were about to discover that some mountains came with guardians, and some guardians never forgot how to wage war. The four men broke camp just after sunrise, moving with the practiced efficiency that Kane had observed the night before. Through his rifle scope, he watched them divide into two teams and begin moving toward different sectors of his property. They had clearly scouted the area beforehand and knew where the game trails converged near the natural salt licks that attracted elk and deer. Kane recognized the leader immediately. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair beneath a camouflage cap and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. He carried a high-end hunting rifle with a scope that probably cost more than most people made in a month. But it was the way he moved that caught Kane's attention. The man had military training evident in how he used hand signals to communicate with his companions and maintain tactical spacing as they advanced. The other three men appeared to be civilians, wealthy hunters who had paid good money for the opportunity to take trophy animals without the inconvenience of hunting licenses or legal restrictions. Kane had encountered similar groups before, usually guided by former military personnel, who used their skills to facilitate illegal hunting operations on public and private land. Kane followed the main group at a distance of roughly 400 yards, close enough to observe their activities but far enough to remain undetected. His ghillie suit made him virtually invisible against the forest backdrop, and his movement skills ensured that he left no trail for anyone to follow. This was familiar territory for Kane, both literally and figuratively. He had spent years tracking hostile forces through terrain far more dangerous than the Colorado mountains. The poachers reached their first hunting position at a natural clearing where elk frequently came to graze. Kane watched through his scope as they set up a sophisticated blind using portable camouflage screens and prepared their weapons for what they clearly expected to be a profitable morning. Their equipment was impressive. Thermal imaging scopes, rangefinders, and communication gear that would have been at home on a military operation. Through his earpiece, Kane could hear fragments of their radio communications. The second team had positioned themselves near a water source about half a mile away, creating a crossfire situation that would drive any animals between the two groups. It was an effective strategy that showed careful planning and professional execution. Kane had to admit a grudging respect for their tactical skills, even as he prepared to disrupt their operation. These weren't bumbling weekend hunters stumbling around the woods. They were organized, well-equipped, and clearly experienced in illegal hunting operations. That made them more dangerous, but it also made stopping them more personally satisfying for Kane. The first elk appeared at the edge of the clearing just before 8 o'clock. It was a magnificent bull with a rack that would score high in any hunting competition. Exactly the kind of trophy that wealthy poachers paid premium prices to acquire. Kane watched the animal through his scope, admiring its natural grace and power. On his property, the elk had learned to trust humans, or at least to tolerate the presence of the one human who protected rather than hunted them. The lead poacher raised his rifle and began tracking the elk through his scope. Kane could see the man's finger moving to the trigger, preparing to take a shot that would end the animal's life for no reason other than the bragging rights that came with an illegal trophy. Kane made his decision. He shifted his aim from the elk to the poacher's rifle and fired a single, precisely placed shot. The bullet struck the weapon's scope with devastating accuracy, shattering the expensive optics and sending fragments of metal and glass into the shooter's face. The man screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching his face as blood streamed between his fingers. His companions immediately took cover behind trees and rocks, shouting questions and orders in the chaos that followed Kane's shot. The elk bolted for the safety of the deeper forest, alerted by the gunfire and the scent of human blood. Kane's radio crackled with panicked communications from the second poaching team, demanding to know what had happened and whether they were under attack. The answer to that question was becoming clearer by the moment. The wounded poacher was calling for evacuation, claiming that a sniper had targeted their position. His military-trained leader was trying to maintain control, ordering his men to stay in cover and identify the source of the gunfire. But Kane could see the fear in their movements, the way they hugged the ground and kept their heads down. Kane fired again, this time putting a bullet into the ground 6 inches from the leader's position. The message was clear. He could have killed the man easily if that had been his intention. The psychological impact of precisely placed shots was often more effective than actual casualties, a lesson Kane had learned in counterinsurgency operations overseas. The leader shouted orders to his team, trying to organize a tactical withdrawal while maintaining some semblance of military discipline. But his men were hunters, not soldiers. They had signed up for easy money and trophy kills, not a firefight with an unknown sniper who could apparently hit anything he aimed at. Kane shifted position, moving silently through the forest to a new vantage point that would give him overlapping fields of fire on both poaching teams. His radio intercepted more of their communications, revealing the growing panic as they realized they were being hunted by someone with superior skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The second poaching team was already in full retreat, abandoning their equipment and heading for the property boundary at a pace that suggested sheer panic. Kane let them go, focusing his attention on the original group that still included the wounded man and his increasingly desperate companions. Through his scope, Kane could see the leader examining his wounded teammates' injuries. The man would need medical attention, but the cuts from the shattered scope weren't life-threatening. Kane had deliberately chosen a non-lethal but psychologically devastating shot, designed to send a message rather than cause permanent harm. The leader pulled out a satellite phone and began making a call, probably to request emergency evacuation or backup support. Kane couldn't allow outside interference in what was rapidly becoming his personal war against the poaching operation. He fired again, this time destroying the satellite phone with a shot that left no doubt about his marksmanship skills. The psychological warfare was having its intended effect. The remaining poachers were now completely focused on escape rather than hunting, exactly the outcome Kane had hoped to achieve. But he wasn't finished with them yet. These men had violated his sanctuary, threatened the wildlife he protected, and shown complete disrespect for his clearly marked property boundaries. Kane began what he mentally classified as a harassment campaign, designed to drive the intruders from his land while demonstrating the futility of any future incursions. He fired shots that bracketed their positions without actually hitting them, creating the impression of an invisible enemy who could strike from anywhere at any time. The poachers tried to return fire, but they were shooting at shadows and sounds, wasting ammunition on targets that didn't exist. Kane could hear their growing desperation in their radio communications, their increasing panic as they realized they were completely outmatched by an opponent they couldn't see or effectively engage. The wounded man was becoming a liability for his team, slowing their movement and requiring constant attention. Kane could see the leader calculating odds and making hard decisions about priorities. Military training taught leaders to make brutal choices when necessary, but these men weren't prepared for the psychological pressure of being hunted by an expert. Kane decided to increase that pressure, began moving closer to their position, using natural cover and his superior fieldcraft skills to remain invisible while tightening the noose around his quarry. Every few minutes he would fire another precisely placed shot, each one closer than the last, each one a reminder that their lives were in his hands. The breaking point came when Kane put a bullet through the leader's hat, removing it from his head without touching his skin. The shot was impossible by normal standards, a demonstration of marksmanship that bordered on supernatural. Kane could see the man's face through his scope, could watch the exact moment when professional composure gave way to primal fear. The retreat became a rout. The three uninjured men grabbed their wounded companion and began a desperate flight toward the property boundary, abandoning equipment worth thousands of dollars in their haste to escape. Kane followed them at a distance, herding them like a sheepdog driving livestock, ensuring they took the most direct route off his property. At the boundary line, Kane fired a final shot into the air, a farewell gesture that sent the poachers scrambling into their vehicles and speeding down the mountain road. Through binoculars, he watched them disappear around the first curve, probably not stopping until they reached the safety of the main highway. Kane emerged from the forest and surveyed the abandoned equipment scattered around the poaching site. High-end rifles, expensive optics, communication gear, and camping equipment worth more than many people's annual salary lay scattered across his property like the remnants of a defeated army. He gathered the weapons and valuable equipment, partly as compensation for the trespassing and partly to prevent their use in future poaching operations. The gear would be useful additions to his own collection, and selling some of it would help cover the costs of maintaining his security systems. As Kane walked back toward his cabin, he felt a satisfaction that he hadn't experienced in 3 years of peaceful mountain living. The skills that had made him an effective soldier were still sharp, still capable of achieving decisive results when properly applied. He had protected his sanctuary and its wildlife while sending a clear message to anyone who might consider future incursions. But Kane didn't know that the leader of the poaching team had recognized him during those terrifying moments when death had whispered past his ear. Former Navy SEAL Marcus Kane had made enemies during his military service, people who had long memories and the resources to act on old grudges. The mountain had its guardian, but the guardian had just revealed himself to forces that would not be satisfied with a simple retreat. The war for Kane Mountain was just beginning. 3 days after driving off the poachers, Kane's world began to unravel in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He was performing his morning routine of checking the perimeter cameras when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. 4 new heat signatures had appeared on his thermal imaging system during the night, but these intruders were different from the amateur poachers he had confronted earlier. These men moved like ghosts through the forest, maintaining perfect tactical spacing and using advanced counter-surveillance techniques to avoid his camera network. Kane could see from their movement patterns that they were professionals, probably former military or intelligence operatives with skills comparable to his own. They had positioned themselves at strategic points around his property, creating a loose containment perimeter that suggested a much more serious threat. Kane felt a familiar chill run down his spine, the same sensation he had experienced in Afghanistan when enemy snipers had bracketed his position. These weren't random trespassers or even professional poachers looking for easy money. These men were here for him specifically, and they had the training and equipment to make his life very difficult. He pulled up the archived footage from the previous encounter and studied the face of the poaching team's leader, zooming in on the man's features and trying to place him in the catalog of faces that populated his memory. After 15 years of military service, Kane had encountered hundreds of people in dozens of countries, many of them in circumstances where faces were the difference between friend and enemy. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. The man was Viktor Petrov, a former Russian Spetsnaz officer who had worked as a mercenary and weapons dealer in various global hotspots. Kane had encountered Petrov twice during his military career, both times in situations that had ended badly for the Russian and his associates. The first encounter had been in Syria, where Kane had been tasked with eliminating a weapons cache that Petrov was trying to sell to local insurgents. Kane's sniper shot had killed Petrov's business partner and destroyed the weapons shipment, costing the Russian millions of dollars and considerable credibility in the international arms market. The second encounter had been even more personal. In Afghanistan, Kane had been part of a special operations team that had raided a compound where Petrov was training Taliban fighters in advanced combat techniques. The raid had resulted in the deaths of 12 fighters and the capture of valuable intelligence, but Petrov had escaped in the chaos. Now, 3 years later, Viktor Petrov had apparently tracked Kane to his mountain sanctuary and assembled a team of professionals to settle old scores. The poaching operation had probably been a reconnaissance mission designed to test Kane's defenses and capabilities while providing plausible cover for the real surveillance operation. Kane moved to his secure communications equipment and attempted to contact his former military handlers, but the encrypted channels that had once connected him to the Pentagon and CIA were now silent. After 3 years of civilian life, his security clearances had been downgraded, and his former colleagues had moved on to new assignments and new priorities. He was on his own, facing an enemy who knew his identity and capabilities, with no backup and no official support. It was a scenario that Kane had faced many times during his military career, but never on his own property with his sanctuary and everything he had built at risk. Kane began immediate preparations for what he now recognized as a siege. He activated backup power systems that would keep his surveillance network operational, even if his primary generators were sabotaged. He moved weapons and ammunition to strategic positions around his property, creating multiple fighting positions that would allow him to engage targets from different angles and ranges. Most importantly, he began psychological preparations for a type of warfare that he had hoped never to face again. The mountain had been his refuge from the violence and moral complexity of his military service, but now that violence had followed him home like a persistent shadow. Through his scope, Kane could see that Petrov's team was conducting professional reconnaissance of his defenses, probing his camera network and testing his response times. They were methodical and patient, gathering intelligence for what Kane assumed would be a coordinated assault designed to either capture or eliminate him. But Kane had advantages that his enemies couldn't fully appreciate. He had spent 3 years learning every trail, every hiding place, and every tactical advantage that his property offered. He knew where the wind patterns would affect long-range shooting, which approaches were vulnerable to ambush, and how to use the terrain to multiply his defensive capabilities. More importantly, Kane was fighting to defend something he truly valued. The mountain sanctuary represented everything he had worked towards since leaving military service: peace, independence, and a connection to the natural world that had been healing his psychological wounds. He would not give it up without a fight that would cost his enemies far more than they were prepared to pay. The first probe came just after midnight on the fourth day. Kane detected movement on his southern perimeter, where a single operative was testing his response to a potential infiltration. Kane watched the man through his thermal imaging system, noting the professional way he moved through the forest and the sophisticated equipment he carried. Instead of confronting the infiltrator directly, Kane decided to demonstrate the futility of their surveillance efforts. He used his knowledge of the property's geography to circle around behind the operative, approaching to within 50 yards without being detected. Then he fired a single shot into a tree trunk 6 inches from the man's head. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The operative dropped to the ground and began a desperate crawl toward the property boundary, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. Kane let him go, knowing that the man would report back to Petrov with a clear message. The mountain's guardian was aware of their presence and could strike from any direction, without warning. But Kane's demonstration of superiority carried a cost he hadn't anticipated. By revealing his capabilities so dramatically, he had escalated the conflict beyond the point of diplomatic resolution. Petrov would now commit to a full-scale assault, knowing that anything less would result in the systematic elimination of his team. The next morning brought confirmation of Kane's fears. His thermal imaging detected at least 8 new heat signatures moving onto his property from multiple directions, suggesting that Petrov had called in reinforcements for a coordinated attack. Kane was now facing odds of at least 12-1 against opponents who had professional military training and modern equipment. Kane activated the emergency protocols he had hoped never to use. He sent encrypted messages to 3 former military colleagues, veterans he trusted with his life who would ask no questions if he called for help. But response time would be measured in hours or days, not the minutes that might determine his survival. He also activated a dead man's switch that would transmit his location and situation to federal law enforcement agencies if he failed to reset it every 12 hours. If Petrov's team succeeded in eliminating him, they would find themselves facing a federal investigation that would make their lives extremely complicated. But Kane's most important preparation was psychological. He needed to shift from the defensive mindset of a property owner protecting his sanctuary to the offensive mindset of a soldier conducting asymmetric warfare against a superior force. The mountain would no longer be his peaceful refuge but his battlefield, and every tree, rock, and trail would become a weapon in his arsenal. As darkness fell on what Kane sensed would be the decisive night, he made a choice that would have consequences extending far beyond his property boundaries. Instead of waiting for Petrov's assault, he would take the fight to the enemy, using his superior knowledge of the terrain to hunt the hunters who had invaded his sanctuary. Kane painted his face with camouflage paint and checked his equipment one final time. His rifle was loaded with match-grade ammunition that could penetrate body armor at the ranges he expected to engage. His knife was razor-sharp and balanced for both utility and combat use. His night vision equipment gave him a significant advantage in the mountain darkness. Most importantly, Kane carried with him 15 years of combat experience and a cold rage that had been building since the moment he realized his enemies had tracked him to his mountain home. They had violated not just his property but his carefully constructed peace, and they would pay a price that would serve as a warning to anyone who might consider similar action in the future. As Kane disappeared into the forest that had sheltered him for 3 years, he transformed from a retired soldier seeking peace into a lethal predator, defending his territory. The mountain had taught him patience and appreciation for the natural world, but it had not erased the skills that made him one of the most dangerous men alive when circumstances demanded violence. Petrov and his team were about to discover that some prey fought back, and some mountains came with guardians who remembered exactly how to wage war. Kane moved through the darkness like a specter, his night vision equipment turning the mountain forest into a green-tinted world where death could come from any shadow. He had divided Petrov's forces into 3 groups based on their radio communications and movement patterns: a command element positioned near his southern boundary, an assault team moving toward his cabin from the east, and a blocking force that was supposed to cut off his escape routes to the north. The tactical situation reminded Kane of countless operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where small American units had faced superior numbers through superior training, equipment, and local knowledge. The mountain terrain gave him the same advantages that Afghan mujahideen had used against Soviet forces: concealment, mobility, and the ability to strike without warning before melting back into familiar landscape. Kane's first target was the blocking force, positioned along what they assumed was his primary escape route. Through his scope, he could see 3 men in tactical gear, armed with assault rifles and equipped with night vision devices that were good but not quite as sophisticated as his own. They had chosen their position well, commanding a natural choke point where the main trail descended toward the county road. but the men were thinking like soldiers rather than mountain fighters. They had positioned themselves for maximum fields of fire and mutual support, textbook tactics that worked well on conventional battlefields but ignored the three-dimensional nature of mountain warfare. Kane approached their position from above, using a game trail that followed the ridgeline and provided access to high ground overlooking their defensive positions. The shot was routine by Kane's standards, a 400-yard downhill engagement with minimal wind compensation required. He placed the crosshairs on the lead operative's chest and squeezed the trigger with the mechanical precision of a man who had made similar shots hundreds of times. The suppressed rifle coughed softly, and the target dropped without a sound. The dead man's companions reacted with professional discipline, immediately seeking cover and trying to identify the source of the gunfire. But Kane was already moving, using the terrain to circle around their position while maintaining visual contact through his scope. He had learned in Iraq that mobility was life in sniper warfare, that staying in one position after taking a shot was usually fatal when facing competent opposition. Kane's second shot came from a completely different angle, striking another operative in the thigh and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope with a scream that echoed across the valley.
The wound was deliberately non-fatal but debilitating, designed to remove the man from the fight while creating a psychological burden for his surviving teammate. The surviving member of the blocking force broke under the pressure of being hunted by an invisible enemy.
Kane could hear him on the radio screaming for evacuation and reporting that they were under attack by a sniper with supernatural abilities. The panic in his voice would be transmitted to every other member of Petrov's force, spreading fear and uncertainty through their ranks.
Kane allowed the wounded man and his panicked companion to withdraw from the battlefield, knowing that their terror would be more valuable than their deaths. Word would spread through Petrov's organization that Kane was not just alive but actively hunting them, and that information would make future recruitment for similar operations much more difficult.
With the northern escape route secured, Kane turned his attention to the assault team that was advancing on his cabin. These men were moving with more caution than the blocking force, clearly aware that they were entering the most dangerous part of the battlefield.
Kane's thermal imaging showed 4 operators in tactical formation, advancing by bounds while maintaining communications discipline that suggested superior training. Kane decided to demonstrate that even superior training was inadequate when facing an enemy who controlled the terrain.
He had prepared his cabin for exactly this type of assault, with remotely detonated charges positioned along the most likely approach routes. The explosives weren't designed to kill but to channel the attackers into predetermined kill zones, where Kane's precision rifle would be most effective. The first explosion erupted 50 yards from the cabin, sending dirt and debris high into the air while illuminating the assault team in the brief flash of the detonation. Kane had triggered the charge when the team was perfectly positioned in an open area with minimal cover, forcing them to choose between advancing through the kill zone or retreating into terrain that Kane had already compromised.
The team leader made the tactically correct decision to continue the assault, gambling that speed and aggression would carry them through Kane's defensive perimeter before he could engage them effectively. It was a sound military decision that might have worked against a conventional defender, but Kane was far from conventional.
As the assault team rushed toward his cabin, Kane engaged them from a position they couldn't have anticipated, the roof of a storage building that overlooked their approach route. His elevated position gave him clear shots at all 4 attackers, while providing excellent concealment and multiple escape routes.
Kane's first shot struck the team leader's center mass, dropping him instantly and throwing the assault into chaos. His second shot shattered the knee of another operative, sending the man crashing into a tree with enough force to render him unconscious. The surviving 2 attackers tried to locate Kane's position by following the muzzle flash, but he was already moving to his next firing position. The psychological warfare that Kane had learned in counterinsurgency operations was proving as effective as his marksmanship. The surviving members of the assault team were now dealing not just with accurate gunfire but with the growing realization that they were facing an opponent who could predict their movements and counter their tactics with deadly precision. Kane triggered a second explosive device as the surviving attackers tried to flank his last known position.
The blast didn't injure them directly but created a wall of smoke and debris that masked his movement while further disorienting his enemies. By the time the smoke cleared, Kane had repositioned to yet another vantage point with clear fields of fire.
The assault team's discipline finally broke when Kane placed a shot between the 2 survivors that was accurate enough to part the hair of both men simultaneously. The demonstration of impossible marksmanship convinced them that retreat was their only option for survival. They grabbed their wounded teammates and began a fighting withdrawal toward the property boundary, maintaining some semblance of military order even as their mission collapsed around them. Kane let them go, knowing that Petrov would be monitoring their communications and drawing increasingly desperate conclusions about his tactical situation. The Russian had committed 8 men to eliminating a single target and had lost half his force without inflicting any casualties on Kane.
The mathematics of attrition warfare were working decisively in Kane's favor. But Kane knew that desperate men with nothing to lose were often the most dangerous opponents. Petrov still had the command element positioned near the southern boundary, and a cornered professional soldier could be expected to make choices that prioritized revenge over survival.
Through intercepted radio communications, Kane could hear Petrov reorganizing his remaining forces for what appeared to be a final assault on the cabin. The Russian was gambling everything on a direct attack, probably hoping to capture Kane alive, for interrogation about other classified operations that had cost Petrov money and credibility over the years. Kane made his way back to the cabin, moving carefully through terrain that had been contested by professional soldiers for the past several hours. Bodies and blood marked the locations where the brief, violent encounters had taken place. Evidence of a war that would never appear in official records or military histories. At the cabin, Kane activated his final defensive system, a network of motion sensors and automated firing systems that would engage any target that entered the predetermined kill zones around his home. The technology was illegal for civilian use but highly effective for protecting high-value installations, and Kane had long ago decided that his sanctuary qualified as high value. As dawn approached over Kane Mountain, the sound of helicopters began to echo through the valleys. Kane initially assumed that Petrov had called in air support for his final assault, but the radio chatter he intercepted told a different story. Federal agents had responded to his dead man's switch transmission and were now conducting a full-scale manhunt for the foreign operatives who had invaded American soil to settle personal vendettas. Through his binoculars, Kane could see Petrov and his surviving men realizing that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They had minutes, not hours, to complete their mission before facing capture or elimination by federal forces that would not be constrained by concerns about collateral damage or due process. The final confrontation was approaching, and Kane prepared to face the man who had tracked him across continents in years, to settle accounts that should have been forgotten. The mountain had become a battlefield, but Kane was no longer just defending his sanctuary.
He was protecting something larger, the principle that some places in America remained beyond the reach of foreign enemies, no matter how patient or well-equipped they might be. The war for Kane Mountain was about to reach its climax, and only one side would survive to tell the story. The helicopters circled closer as dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, their rotor wash creating small tornadoes of dust and fallen leaves that marked the arrival of federal forces. Kane could see 3 aircraft through his binoculars, 2 FBI tactical helicopters and a military transport that probably carried a special operations team with authority to engage foreign combatants on American soil. Petrov's voice crackled through Kane's radio intercept system, speaking in rapid Russian to his surviving men. Kane's knowledge of the language acquired during his military service allowed him to understand that the Russian was ordering a desperate final assault on the cabin. Petrov knew that capture by American forces would mean either a lifetime in federal prison or a quiet elimination that would never be officially acknowledged. Kane watched through his thermal imaging as Petrov's remaining 4 men began moving toward his cabin from multiple directions, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. They were professionals facing a no-win situation, and their desperation made them more dangerous than ever. Men with nothing to lose often fought with a ferocity that overcame superior tactics and equipment. The first federal helicopter settled into a clearing about half a mile from Kane's property, disgorging a team of tactical agents in full combat gear. Kane could see them through his scope as they began moving toward the sound of gunfire, their approach methodical but cautious. They had no way of knowing which combatants were friendly and which were hostile, a confusion that Kane needed to resolve quickly before becoming a target himself. Kane activated an emergency beacon that transmitted his military service record and current situation to the approaching federal forces. The signal identified him as a decorated veteran defending his property against foreign operatives, providing the legal justification for his actions while requesting support rather than intervention. Within minutes, his radio crackled with a transmission from the FBI tactical commander. "Kane, this is Agent Harrison, FBI hostage rescue team. We have you marked as friendly.
Can you identify hostile positions?" Kane keyed his radio with relief that he wouldn't have to fight American forces along with Petrov's mercenaries. "Harrison, Kane here.
4 hostiles converging on my position from grid coordinates." Kane provided precise locations for each of Petrov's men, intelligence that would allow the federal agents to coordinate their approach with his defensive efforts. But Petrov had been listening to the same radio traffic, and he understood that his window of opportunity was measured in minutes rather than hours. The Russians' assault on Kane's cabin began with a coordinated attack from 3 directions, designed to overwhelm Kane's defenses through sheer volume of fire rather than tactical finesse. Kane met the assault from his prepared positions around the cabin, engaging targets with the precision that had made him legendary among his former military colleagues. His first shot dropped the operative approaching from the west, a clean hit at 200 yards that removed one threat from the tactical equation. His second shot wounded the man advancing from the north, sending him seeking cover behind a fallen tree that provided concealment but not protection.
The sound of Kane's suppressed rifle was almost lost in the cacophony of automatic weapons fire that erupted from Petrov's remaining men. They were laying down suppressive fire designed to pin Kane in position while their leader maneuvered for a killing shot. But Kane had anticipated this tactic and prepared accordingly. Kane triggered a series of remote-controlled explosions that he had positioned around his property months earlier, creating walls of smoke and debris that masked his movement while providing psychological shock to his attackers. The blasts were carefully calculated to disorient rather than kill, designed to break up Petrov's assault, without causing collateral damage that might complicate his legal situation.
Through the smoke and chaos, Kane could see Petrov himself advancing on the cabin with the methodical precision of a professional soldier. The Russian carried a sniper rifle similar to Kane's own weapon, and his movement suggested someone who understood the deadly chess game they were playing. This would be a duel between equals, decided by small advantages in equipment, positioning, and psychological pressure. Kane and Petrov engaged simultaneously, their rifles firing within milliseconds of each other, in a demonstration of marksmanship that would have been impossible for civilian hunters. Kane's shot struck the tree beside Petrov's head, sending splinters of wood into the Russian's face and forcing him to seek cover. Petrov's bullet passed so close to Kane's ear that he could feel the shockwave, a reminder that death was only inches away at any moment. The duel continued across the mountain battlefield as both snipers used their skills and equipment to gain tactical advantages. Kane knew every inch of the terrain and had prepared fighting positions that maximized his fields of fire while providing multiple escape routes. Petrov had superior equipment and the desperation of a man with nothing to lose, making him unpredictable and dangerous. The arrival of federal agents changed the tactical situation dramatically. Kane could hear them advancing through the forest with professional discipline, their radio communications indicating that they had located and were engaging Petrov's surviving subordinates. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed across the valley as American tactical teams eliminated the foreign operatives who had violated national sovereignty to settle personal grievances. Petrov's voice came over Kane's radio intercept system, speaking in accented English that carried a mixture of rage and grudging respect. "Kane, you have cost me everything over the years. My money, my reputation, my men. Today, one of us dies on this mountain." Kane keyed his own radio, broadcasting on a frequency that both Petrov and the federal agents could monitor. "Petrov, you came to my mountain. You threatened my sanctuary. You brought war to a place where I sought peace. Today you learn what that cost." The final engagement came as the morning sun broke through the forest canopy, creating shafts of light that illuminated the battlefield like a natural cathedral. Kane and Petrov spotted each other simultaneously across a clearing where elk had grazed peacefully just days earlier, their rifles trained on each other in a confrontation that had been building for years. Both men fired at the same instant, their bullets crossing in midair with ballistic precision that defied civilian comprehension. Kane felt Petrov's shot tug at his sleeve as he rolled behind cover, while his own bullet found its mark with the accuracy that had made him feared across multiple continents. Viktor Petrov dropped his rifle and fell backward, Kane's bullet having found the narrow gap between his body armor plates. The Russian lay motionless in the morning sunlight. His personal war finally ended on a mountain that had never known his name until he brought violence to its slopes. Kane emerged from cover as FBI agents secured the battlefield, their tactical teams efficiently processing what remained of Petrov's force. The federal commander, Agent Harrison, approached Kane with the wariness that law enforcement professionals reserve for individuals whose capabilities exceeded normal parameters. "Mr. Kane, we need to debrief this situation, but initially it appears you were defending your property against foreign operatives engaged in illegal activities on American soil. Your actions appear justified under both federal and Colorado state law." Kane nodded, feeling the adrenaline of combat beginning to fade as the reality of his situation became clear. He had successfully defended his mountain sanctuary, but the cost had been a return to the violence he had sought to escape through 3 years of peaceful mountain living. Over the following weeks, federal investigators would piece together the full scope of Petrov's organization and their activities on American soil. The Russian had been running illegal hunting operations across multiple states, using wealthy clients to fund intelligence gathering and weapons smuggling that supported various international criminal enterprises. Kane's mountain became a crime scene that attracted attention from multiple federal agencies, but the investigation ultimately concluded that he had acted within his rights as a property owner and military veteran defending against foreign hostiles. His actions received unofficial commendation from agencies that couldn't publicly acknowledge operations involving former special operations personnel. As autumn settled over Cane Mountain, the battlefield scars began to heal under nature's patient hand.
The elk returned to graze in meadows where gunfire had echoed, and the golden eagles resumed their circling patrol of thermals that rose from sun-warmed valleys. Cane repaired the damage to his cabin and replaced equipment that had been damaged during the fighting.
But something fundamental had changed in Cane's relationship with his mountain sanctuary. The peace he had sought through isolation had been violated by enemies who remembered him from wars he had tried to leave behind.
The mountain remained his refuge, but it was now also a fortress that would require constant vigilance to protect. Cane stood on his porch as the first snows of winter began to fall, watching the wilderness that had become his battlefield and remained his home. He had protected his sanctuary and eliminated threats that had followed him across continents and years. But the cost had been a return to the violence that had defined too much of his life. The mountain had taught him that some battles never truly end, that some enemies never forget, and that the price of peace was often eternal vigilance.
Cane accepted that price, knowing that his sanctuary was worth defending against any force that might threaten it. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the winter moon, and Cane listened with the satisfaction of a guardian who had proven worthy of his territory.
The mountain was his, purchased with blood and defended with skills that he had hoped never to use again. But he had used them when necessary, and he would use them again if anyone was foolish enough to threaten his sanctuary.
The war for Cane Mountain was over, but the guardian remained at his post, watching over a wilderness that had become both his refuge and his responsibility. Some mountains chose their protectors, and some protectors never forgot how to fight for what they loved.